Hey Doodlebugs, I'm going to teach you how to make a flat square stitch earring with fringe today. We're going to start off with a size 10 beading needle per usual, and I'm going to measure about 40 to 60 inches of bead thread. I like to use Fireline, and I'll be using white actually, but 4 pounds is what's important because it just works best with this stitch. Next, I want you to find a bead that you aren't going to use in your piece. It's called a stopper bead, and you're going to thread through it and leave about a 1/2 inch tail. And then I want you to come around through the bottom and back up through the top to make a little loop like this. And it's going to tighten onto the bead once you pull it up all the way through the top, just like that. Now once you get more comfortable with this technique, you can leave it just like this, but for safety precautions, I like to go through it one more time, and that way I have a double loop around this stopper bead. This just makes me feel better that it's not going to come loose and my live beads are not going to fall off the end. Once you finish the piece, you'll be able to take this off and weave in that end. So now we're going to get our beads. For our first column, I've measured here 13 beads. So it's going to be 13 beads up and down our finished piece and then 8 columns across. So this is our first column of 8 with 13 beads, which will make 13 rows. So now we're going to turn it around so that the stopper bead's at the top. And sometimes I put it between my fingers like this, and then you grab one bead and you're going to work down through the top of that first bead at the bottom, and then pull it all the way through. And this is going to feel a little awkward at first, but just trust me here. Once you pull it taut, those 2 little beads are going to sit right next to each other. And then you're going to put your bead up through the bottom of that bead you just worked into and out through the top. Kind of like when you're making the single stitch foundation for the brick stitch. And you're just putting those 2 little guys together. Much easier with bugles, much easier with delicas. And then you get another bead, one at a time, and then you work down through the top of that second bead in your first column, and down through the bottom, and it comes out of that bead, it doesn't come out of the other bead. There we go. Whoop. As you can see, move those out of the way. Now you work up through the bottom of that second bead we just put on, or attached, and out the top. So now we're stacking them up on top of each other instead of side by side. There are other ways to do a flat square stitch, but I want to show you how to do the single bead first. So now we'll work through the third. We get our bead on the needle and we work down through that first bead from the top and out the bottom. And then we loop it tight. Not too tight, but tight enough to where they won't be wobbling everywhere. And then we loop it around. We come up through the bottom of that bead we just worked and out through the top. And be sure your thread doesn't loop around the back of your work like that. Always keep it in the front. And there you go. And so you're going to continue on. I'm going to keep showing this each bead at a time. And here is where I would be starting the color work in the chart that I provided in the description box, but if you're doing this for the first time and you prefer to just stick with one solid color so that all you have to focus on is your technique and the stitch work, that's totally fine. I just wanted to give you guys options. And like I said before, there are other ways to do the flat square stitch, but I want to show you this way first because this is working one bead at a time, and that way you really grasp the concept. There are double stacks and there are triple stacks, much like the brick stitch, but I really like the shape that the single stack gives, and I feel like once you learn this and you work the other ones after, it's going to be cake. So now we've reached the end of our second column, and you're going to work that last bead the way you do all the rest of them and come out through the bottom, and then that live thread will be coming out through the top, and you'll have your two little columns next to each other, and you'll feel some give and take in the tension between both columns, and so this is what we're going to do to remedy that. So you work down into that first column that we created, not too tightly though, and then work up through the bottom of the second column we just created. So we're back where we started. However, these two columns are now quite fortified. Here we go. So the thicker the thread, the less room we're going to have in our beads. So that's why I always go down in my thread weight, because you also want to take into consideration any ends you're going to be weaving in, whether you have fringe or not. Now, when you're first starting out, you may have the urge to pull your beads very tight together as you're working them, but try to find the happy medium between pulling them very tight and having them a little too loose for comfort, because that happy medium is going to give you the flexibility to work through your stitches and the columns and rows when you're weaving in ends, and it won't curl. But of course, if it is too loose, you will have gaps, and we don't want that. So just try to take a deep breath as you work and trust that with each stitch and each row, your piece is going to come together and feel more solid and sturdy. I originally wanted to create an earring inspired by the Picasso bug, but for the tutorial, I thought mapping out that actual color chart might be a little too much, so I decided to just use the color palette for the Picasso bug. And if you'd like to work the color chart, but not necessarily the colors that I chose, the Picasso bug is naturally adorned in complementary colors. So if you refer to a color wheel and you choose whatever pair of complementary colors that you like in conjunction with the black and white beads, I think that they will contain the power of 1,000 suns, obviously. So now we're going to weave back in through these last 2 columns that we've worked, and because we worked 8 columns across, which is an even number, we won't have an odd man out. So that's nice. That works out really well. Now, you may notice that I have a little tail sticking out here in the middle. That's because I wanted to use up this chunk of bead thread that I had that wasn't quite 50 inches long, but I knew that I could weave in a new piece and go through just fine. But for the sake of learning and starting out, I want you to not have to weave in any sort of new thread if you can help it, especially in your woven piece, your foundation piece, which is what this is. And I will be creating a tutorial on how to start new threads and weave them in when you find yourself in that type of situation, but that is not for the sake of this tutorial at the moment. So for this pair of earrings, I'm going to create a very close loop at the top for the ear wire. So we're going to work our way back up through the second column here from the left, at least our left at the moment. And then I'm going to weave down through, and I'm going to come out of this fourth column. And so that's where we're going to work our loop. And make it a habit to pick one side where you're always going to work through and weave your ends. That way, that side has whatever may be exposed in thread, and the other side will be nice and clean, which I'll show you here in a little bit. So now I'm coming out of this fourth column here, and it's like dead center. And then I'm going to get 6 beads, and you can choose what colors you want if you're working in color pattern. And then I'm going to work down into the next column, which is the 5th or the 4th from the other side. And so now we have our little loop, and that's where our ear wire is going to attach. And now you want to fortify that, reinforce it. See, that's the nice side, but this is okay. We can slide on this one. So in order to reinforce this, I like to work through it at least 2 or 3 times to make sure that little loop is not going to tear or go anywhere. So you just work into the next, back into the next column and up through the top of that first little column of 3, and then bend down through. And then you'll want to repeat. And this is why I use a lighter weight thread. I go down to the 4 pound from the 6 pound because all of this reinforcing will really take up a lot of room inside your seed beads. As you can see, it's already kind of catching. But that's okay. You just have to work very patiently and ease them through. Don't ever force, because you'll bust a bead, which is something I've done plenty of times. And then back down through. And it doesn't really matter how many beads you go down, how many rows, as long as it's more than 3 or 4. Or 4 or more. But now, since I'm just weaving in this last little bit, I can go up 3 or go up 2, and it's not going to make a difference. Just when you're first reinforcing that little loop, you want it to hold. And I try not to work all the way out from the top or the bottom, because I just don't like too much exposed thread. So now I'm going to cut this. So now we're ready to work in our fringe. So as I've mentioned in all of my other videos, I used all-purpose sewing thread for my fringe work. You can use 1G or any other bead thread that you'd like for fringe. It's up to you. It's all a matter of preference. I like this thread too because I can just use the same beading needle. I don't ever use sewing needles in my beadwork. No, 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 no. I also double. If you're using 1G or any other specialty thread for beading, you don't have to double it. But because this is sewing thread and it's my personal preference, I double it. So the side facing me I have established is going to be the side where I weave in all my ends. So I come down through that first column. It doesn't matter which side, just choose a side and stick to it. You come down and leave a little tail, and then you wrap that little tail around the top loop that you've just made, It's not going to tie it, it's just going to hold it snug in between the beads so that you don't lose your work. But it's also still open so you can undo it if you need to, if you make a mistake in your color work. So now, here I've just winged it as I went through the tutorial. I took things apart, I put it back together until I found the colors that I liked. But if you're using the color chart, then it'll all be done for you. So here is a very, 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 very important step that I always point out. Remember to skip that bottom bead and work into the second to last bead when you're creating your fringe. If you don't do that, all the beads that you just put on that strand of thread are going to come right off, and you'll have to do it all over again. And you'll be very annoyed, especially if they fall all over the floor. It's not fun. Work up 4 rows into the woven piece and then down 4 rows right here. I think if you want to go up 2 or 3 or 4, that's the range I would give myself. If you worked only into that first bottom row, it might not be sturdy enough, and the fringe might pull that bottom row a little too far away from the rest of the piece, the woven piece, and it would look kind of weird. So 2 minimum, 4 maximum. Anything up higher, you're going to be infringing upon the space that you want to weave in your ends. And so here I wanted to create a little space between either side, so where those 2 middle columns are, the 4th and the 5th, I'm going to skip. So I'm going to come down like I would normally work through, but instead of coming out of that bottom bead, I'm going to come out of the second to bottom bead. Because like I said, I don't like exposed thread any more than I have to. And then I'm going to come up. I'm going to skip that bottom row altogether. So let's just pretend we worked 2 strands of fringe when we really didn't. Because I'm feeling weird today and I want to create a space. So now we're going to continue to work the fringe as we did on the other side. I'm going to come all the way down and out of that bottom bead. And then I'm going to continue my pattern. And yes, you will see me adjusting my strands of fringe throughout the entire creation of the fringe. So now we're going to come up that last bit. And you see this is the side where we started, where it all began, where that stopper bead is. So I'm going to come up, and this I will make an exception because it's the very last strand, and I did it in the front too, where I come up all the way out of the top, just because I want it to be as solid as possible. And just adjust. So see, as long as you're consistent, it's not going to look bad. But it would look kind of weird if I had exposed thread on one side and not on the other. So consistency is key. So now I'm going to work down through and weave in these ends. And I'll show some of the weaving in of the ends because it's not too entirely different from any of the brick stitch weaving that I've shown you guys. But as I said, I always work with the same side facing up. If I work my fringe with this side facing up, I'm going to weave my ends with this side facing up. That way this side can be the back side and the other side can be the side that we present to the world. So now that I'm ready to cut this thread, I'm going to come out from the bottom of the first bead in that space at the foundation. And since I am working on the right side, then I'm going to come out of the row closest to the right, just like that. And now I'm going to cut it. I don't normally do this, but for this particular design, this is what I'm going to do, and I'll show you. Normally I would cut it somewhere in the middle of the woven piece, but sometimes the flat stitch here, the flat square stitch, I just think it doesn't fit, it doesn't sit as snugly together as the brick stitches do. So once I've woven my zigzag, I have it coming out of the bottom of the woven piece, and it just seems to be more secure that way for me. But for this particular piece, I have it coming out of that space, and I'll show you why. So here we can weave in that last end from the fringe down through and out of that second empty space to make it consistent with the other side. Okay, so under normal circumstances, I never use glue, but in this particular situation, this is where it's kind of my friend at the moment. So right in that little spot where I pulled those ends out, it's not too terribly necessary, but I'm the type of person who likes to feel really, really sure about things. So I just put a tiny tiny bit, and I find usually a beat up big eye needle, and I kind of run that through, and this stuff dries very quickly. So if you're ever afraid of ends fraying out, you're just super paranoid about it, you can do that. Sometimes I do that, and it's okay, as long as it's used sparingly. And now we're just going to weave in the rest of the ends. Weave in that, yeah, there we go. And again, everything that you weave in, try to weave it all in on the same side. Oh, this one is stubborn, and you will run into it, so just at this point when you're weaving in those last few strands, you just have to find the path of least resistance, which is why I usually will weave in the gel spun thread last, because I want to make sure I have plenty of room for the fringe. The gel spun thread is much, much lighter than the fringe thread, even if you're using 1G. That 4-pound gel spun is just really, really, really tiny. And also, if you can stomach going down a smaller size needle, by all means do, but I just get very frustrated trying to thread that needle, and it's a give and take. It's a give and take. So you get the idea. Now the stopper bead, you can sometimes pull it off, but since I looped it twice, I'm gonna have to cut it. And then I'll weave it in. And if there are any tiny little ends poking out, you can cinch them with a lighter. And so now you get your ear wire of choice, and you get your pliers, and you make sure you have your pretty side. There's a pretty side. And then, so the pretty side goes with the curvy part of the ear wire, if you're using traditional ear wires like this one. This is sterling silver. I thought it would go nice with this earring here, but to each their own. As long as there's no nickel in the metal, you're good. All right. And the pokey side goes on the side where you wove all those ends in. See? as you can see. Now Punky side, Funky Town side, Funky Town. Sweet and pretty and presentable right here. All right, just gotta make the other one and stretch your stuff.